a general. Whether sublime or ridiculous, the subject was given the same treatment. This was the great innovation of the dialectic. It was a tool that could be applied to anything. Having elicited a definition of the subject, Socrates would then proceed to make holes in it, and in the process a better definition would be achieved. In this way he advanced from particular examples to those with more general application, finally arriving at a universal truth. Such truths, and Socrates' method of arriving at them, were the forerunner of logic, which was to be invented in the following century by Aristotle, Plato's pupil. Aristotle, too, accepted the theory of forms, though he modified it to his own requirements. It was Aristotle who reawakened philosophy's interest in reality, reversing the trend established by Socrates and Plato. Aristotle tried to include everything in philosophy, from cosmology to conchology, from science to sin. But in the end his main success was in mapping out the territory of human knowledge. Once again the emphasis was on theory, rather than on hard knowledge that could be developed for practical use. Consequently, when the Romans conquered the Greeks, philosophy fell into decline. It was of no use, and thus of no use to the Romans. The collapse of the Roman Empire was followed by the Dark Ages, and the religion-dominated civilization of the Middle Ages. Philosophy remained moribund, a vacuum of abstraction, hermetically sealed within religious orthodoxy. The mental energy that created the most intricate, all-embracing, and profound theology the world has ever seen was capable, in technological terms, of inventing little more than the harness, whose mechanics had already been foreseen in the 3rd century BC by Archimedes. Gothic cathedrals arose amidst hovels lining streets of open sewers, and plagues were combated with superstition. This was not Socrates' fault, but the turn our thinking took as a result of his philosophy played a significant part. Human learning owes Socrates an immeasurable debt. He showed us how to use reason, but at the same time he limited our vision of where to use it. As a result, human learning was to suffer from a colossal blind spot. This lasted for no less than 3/4 of the period from the beginnings of philosophy to the present day. An example of this black spot is to be seen in the medieval attitude to the Black Death, the plague that wiped out more than half the population of Europe in the 14th century. The Black Death was known to be contagious from the very start. The disease arrived in the West after plague-ridden corpses were catapulted into a besieged Genoese trading post on the Black Sea. Yet this practical knowledge was largely ignored in favor of spiritual measures. Why? Because logic, the successor to Socrates' dialectic, was habitually applied to abstract ideas, not practical matters. As we have seen, this blind spot is recognizable in Socrates, but he should not be blamed for the enormity of its later consequences, the virtual cessation of human advance. We all make mistakes, even if we are great philosophers. We just don't expect to see them perpetuated for almost 2,000 years. Some observations attributed to Socrates. As Socrates wrote nothing down, it seems only fair to begin with a quotation that explains why he did this. Knowing nothing, what could I write down? He goes on to explain. Once there was an ancient Egyptian god called Thoth. He invented numbers, geometry, astronomy, dice, and writing. One day Thoth went to see Themis, the king of Upper Egypt, and began to show him all he had invented. When Thoth reached the alphabet, he explained, "This is an invention which will greatly improve the wisdom and memory of your people." But the king replied, "Oh, ingenious Thoth, your alphabet will have exactly the opposite effect from the one you claim. As soon as Egyptians begin to rely upon written wisdom, they will stop using their memory and call things to mind not by using their own internal resources as they should, but by using these external signs." Plato, Phaedo, 274-275. After referring to his mother, who was a midwife, Socrates explains his philosophical method, likening it to her work. The obstetrics which I practice is the same as that of all midwives, except that they practice on women, while I do so on men. They deal with the body, and I deal with the mind. I myself am empty of wisdom, which is why the god Apollo makes me attend to the wisdom of others, and prevents me from giving birth myself. Plato, Theaetetus, 149a, 150c. A few quips and anecdotes. The unexamined life is not worth living. Plato, Apology, 38a. Dear Agathon, it is truth you cannot contradict. You can easily contradict Socrates. Plato, Symposium, 201d. A foreigner who knew about faces once passed through Athens. When he encountered Socrates, he told him straight away that he was a monster, that within him he harbored all manner of vices and evil desires. Socrates merely replied, "You know me, sir." Quoted by Nietzsche, Twilight of the Idols. The problem of Socrates. Someone asked Socrates whether he should get married or not, and received the reply, "Do as you please, since whatever you do, you will regret it." Diogenes Laertius, Lives of the Eminent Philosophers, 2-3. Socrates at work. Once more Aristippus asked Socrates if he knew anything beautiful. He replied, "Many things." "Do they all resemble each other?" inquired Aristippus. "Some of them are as unlike each other as it is possible to be." "But how can what is beautiful be unlike what is beautiful?" Socrates replied, "Because one man who is beautifully formed for wrestling is likely to be different from another who is formed for running, and a shield that is beautifully formed for defense is as unlikely as possible to a dart that is beautifully formed for being aggressively and swiftly hurled." Xenophon, Memorabilia of Socrates, 8-4. Socrates at his trial explains the reason for his unpopularity. He recalls that the Delphic oracle, which speaks for the god Apollo, once pronounced him the wisest among men. When I heard of this, I said to myself, "What can the god mean?" For I knew I had no wisdom, and yet I also knew the god did not lie. After meditating for a while on this question, I decided to see if the pronouncement of the god could possibly be true. If I could just find one man who was wiser than myself, then I could refute the god. So I went along to see someone who had the reputation of being wise. I need not mention his name. He was a politician, and the result of our meeting was as follows. When I started talking with him, I couldn't help thinking that he wasn't really very wise at all, although he was thought wise by many, and thought even wiser by himself. Thereupon I tried to explain to him that he only thought he was wise, but wasn't really wise at all. As a result, he hated me, and this enmity was shared by several people who were present and heard what I had said. So I left him, saying to myself as I went, "Well, although I don't suppose either of us knows anything really beautiful and good, I am better off than he is, for he knows nothing and thinks that he knows something. I neither know nor think that I know anything. It looks as if perhaps I do have a slight advantage over him." Then I went to another, who had still higher pretensions to wisdom, and my conclusion was exactly the same, whereupon I made another enemy. Plato, Apology, Chapter 6. Socrates, on the morning of his death in his condemned cell, speaks with his gathered friends of the soul, truth, and immortal wisdom. It appears there is a narrow path which brings us safely to our journey's end, with reason as our guide. As long as we have a body, and this evil can mingle with our soul, we shall never completely attain what we desire, namely truth. For the body is forever wasting our time with its demands. Whenever it is ill, it hinders us in our pursuit of real being. It fills us with passions, desires, fears, and all kinds of imaginings and foolishness. It is always preventing us from thinking properly. The body alone and its desires cause wars, social divisiveness, and battles. For the origin of all war is the desire for wealth, and we are forced to pursue wealth because we are enslaved by the wishes of the body. On account of all this, we have no leisure for philosophy. Even if we manage to free ourselves from the body for a while, and try to examine some matter, it hinders us at every step of our inquiry, causing confusion and trouble and panic, so that we cannot see the truth for it. Truly, we have learned that if we are to have any pure knowledge at all, we must be freed from the body. The soul by itself can see things as they truly are. Only after we are dead, it seems, can we gain the wisdom that we desire, and for which we claim to have a passion. But this cannot happen while we are alive, as my argument shows. For if it is impossible to have pure knowledge while we have a body, one or two things must be true. Either we can never gain any true knowledge, or we can only gain it after we are dead. For then, and only then, will the soul exist by itself, separate from the body. While we live, we come closest to true knowledge if we have no use for or communion with the body beyond what is absolutely necessary, and if we are not defiled by its nature. We must live pure of the body until God releases us. When we are thus pure and released from the follies of the body, we shall dwell, I imagine, with others who are pure like ourselves, and we shall of ourselves know all that is pure. Plato, Phaedo. Already it is time for us to part, for me to die, for you to continue living. Whichever of us takes the better course is unknown to anyone but God. Plato, Apology, 42a. Chronology of Socrates' life. 469 BC. Socrates born just outside Athens. Before 440 BC, Delphic oracle pronounces Socrates the wisest of men. Circa 430 BC, Socrates serves as hoplite, common soldier, in the Peloponnesian War, and saves life of Alcibiades at Battle of Potidaea. 423 BC, Socrates parodied in comedy by Aristophanes. Circa 420 BC, marries Xanthippe. During the ensuing decade, they have 3 sons. 406 to 405 BC, serves as member of the Legislative Council, Bull. 404 BC, refuses 30 tyrants' order to arrest Leon. 399 BC, charged with impiety and corruption of youth. Trial of Socrates, which ends in him being sentenced to death. Takes judicial hemlock and dies. Chronology of Socrates' era. 460s BC, Aeschylus, the first classical tragic dramatist at the height of his powers. 460 BC, outbreak of First Peloponnesian War between Athens and Sparta. Birth of Hippocrates, the traditional founder of medicine, on the island of Kos. 445 BC, end of First Peloponnesian War. Mid-440s BC, beginning of Golden Era in Athens under rule of Pericles. During this period, Athenian culture flourishes at its greatest. 447 BC, construction of the Parthenon begins on the Acropolis at Athens. 441 to 440 BC, revolt of Samos breaks peace in the Aegean. 431 BC, outbreak of Second Great Peloponnesian War between Sparta and Athens. 429 BC, death of Pericles. 428 BC, death of Anaxagoras, first Athenian philosopher, teacher of Socrates and Pericles. 415 BC, Athens launches great expedition to conquer Sicily, which ends in disaster. 404 BC, Second Peloponnesian War ends in humiliating defeat of Athens. 30 tyrants take power in Athens. 403 BC, 30 tyrants deposed and democracy restored. 400 BC, reform of the laws and general amnesty, which does not apply a year later to Socrates. Chronology of significant philosophical dates. 6th century BC, the beginning of Western philosophy with Thales of Miletus. End of 6th century BC, death of Pythagoras. 399 BC, Socrates sentenced to death in Athens. Circa 387 BC, Plato founds the Academy in Athens, the first university. 335 BC, Aristotle founds the Lyceum in Athens, a rival school to the Academy. 324 AD, Emperor Constantine moves capital of Roman Empire to Byzantium. 400 AD. St. Augustine writes his Confessions, philosophy absorbed into Christian theology. 410 AD. Sack of Rome by Visigoths heralds opening of Dark Ages. 529 AD. Closure of Academy in Athens by Emperor Justinian marks end of Hellenic thought. Mid-13th century. Thomas Aquinas writes his Commentaries on Aristotle, era of scholasticism. 1453. Fall of Byzantium to Turks, end of Byzantine Empire. 1492. Columbus reaches America. Renaissance in Florence and revival of interest in Greek learning. 1543. Copernicus publishes On the Revolution of the Celestial Orbs, proving mathematically that the Earth revolves around the Sun. 1633. Galileo forced by Church to recant heliocentric theory of the universe. 1641. Descartes publishes his Meditations, the start of modern philosophy. 1677. Death of Spinoza allows publication of his Ethics. 1687. Newton publishes Principia, introducing concept of gravity. 1689. Locke publishes Essay Concerning Human Understanding, start of empiricism. 1710. Berkeley publishes Principles of Human Knowledge, advancing empiricism to new extremes. 1716. Death of Leibniz. 1739 to 1740. Hume publishes Treatise of Human Nature, taking empiricism to its logical limits. 1781. Kant, awakened from his dogmatic slumbers by Hume, publishes Critique of Pure Reason. Great era of German metaphysics begins. 1807. Hegel publishes The Phenomenology of Mind, high point of German metaphysics. 1818. Schopenhauer publishes The World as Will and Representation, introducing Indian philosophy into German metaphysics. 1889. Nietzsche, having declared God is dead, succumbs to madness in Turin. 1921. Wittgenstein publishes Tractatus Logico-Philosophicus, claiming the final solution to the problems of philosophy. 1920s. Vienna Circle propounds logical positivism. 1927. Heidegger publishes Being and Time, heralding split between analytical and continental philosophy. 1943. Sartre publishes Being and Nothingness, advancing Heidegger's thought and instigating existentialism. 1953. Posthumous publication of Wittgenstein's Philosophical Investigations. High era of linguistic analysis. This concludes the reading of Socrates in 90 Minutes by Paul Strathern, 1997. This book was read by Robert Whitfield. Unabridged record 2004.